And I'm really pleased, like I said, to see you. Today's talk, I assume most of you have read Ruthie here. Somebody called me when they saw that it was the book and said, "Is that the same book by that guy 2 years ago, Come West and See?" And which didn't go over particularly well, but that was my idea, was to be controversial when I picked that. And I was right. So this is Max's first regular book, novel. I don't know what to say. I will ask him later what he's working on now. This book has a singular, I think, honor within one book. I've been doing this for 11 years, and so I picked 55 books. This book was reviewed in the short reviews in New York, which is, when you think about it, if you know much about books, it's truly incredible. It's somebody, they paid a lot of attention to New York and the West Coast, and there's this undifferentiated whatever between them. And so it's a real feather in Max's cap to have his book reviewed. I asked him, did it make a difference in sales? And he said, oh yeah. A double bonus. So Max is going to talk a little bit, and then I assume there always are lots of questions. Thanks for coming. The next book is Prison in the Driveway. It will be available the 1st of October. So I hope all of you are long-time One Book Billings people and will continue with us. Yeah.
Bernie, I'm new to One Book Billings, as are these
Okay.
two people, but I just wanted to thank you for, I had never heard of this until last year when I was looking for something and stumbled on this. So I'd just like to thank you for your involvement.
Sometimes I think it's the best kept secret in Billings.
Yeah.
But, I mean, there are probably a couple hundred people who have done it over the years. And, people drop in and out. And, we only had 50 some odd people this time. We ordered 100 books. So there's a lot more room. Tell your friends. Tell them that you enjoyed this. I try and pick books that I think people will enjoy. Sometimes ones are a little edgy. Sometimes not. It's hard because there are an awful lot of books published in Montana, about Montana or by Montana authors. We're truly blessed to live in a state like this. There probably are a lot, I reviewed a book a couple of years ago on authors about arts in Colorado, and the writers section had about a half a dozen books for authors. I can name you a half a dozen authors who live within 2 or 3 miles of here, who are well published and well known. It's a pretty incredible place. For this and for lots of others. Well, I go on.
Can I ask another quick question? Do you have a list of the 55 books that
Yes,
where
if you want,
Yeah.
I have a list of all the books.
Yeah.
Write me at bernardrose23@me.com,
Oh,
and I will send you the list.
okay, great, thank you.
Here's Max.
Thank you, Bernie, and thank you all so much for coming. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here, and just to echo, it's such a special thing. And as an author, I'm so appreciative of groups that get together and search and seek out new fiction, because that's what keeps us writers going. And I'm going to do 2 things. I want to leave most of the time for you guys' questions and just to talk with you about the book after you've read it. But I am going to talk a little bit about my thought process going into it, and then I'm going to read a brief section as well. But I want to start by just giving, and I've had a lot of chance to think about this, because when you write a book, you often get asked, what were you trying to do? Where did this come from? And you also get asked that whenever you're applying for various kinds of grants and fellowships, or sending out notices about what you're working on next. So I wrote a brief, a few paragraphs about where Ruthie came from, and I want to start by sharing those with you guys. And to just give you a little bit of a preface, I grew up in and around Missoula in the 90s, basically. My lifetime really mirrors Ruthie's. And a lot of hiking in the Bitterroot Valley. As a boy walking in the Montana woods, I felt that literally anything was possible around each bend. From the towering beauty of a hawk skimming over a snow-covered field of scree, to the horror of a mutilated deer carcass, and beyond, spirits, ghosts, the whispered memories of the land. I knew they were present because I felt them. It's this sense of wonder and possibility that I tried to capture in Ruthie Fear. It begins with a girl watching her father hunt for the first time and seeing beyond the act, into the fabric of our interconnected reality. Her mind processes a flock of geese as the skeletal remains of a vast interstellar being, irrevocably shattered by a blast from her father's shotgun. Later, watching the animals that pass by their property from a hunting blind, she sees another inexplicable apparition, a headless creature attempting to drink from a canyon creek. This creature haunts her for the rest of her life as the avatar for the broken link between men and nature, the loneliness and alienation of the modern world. I've always loved Western literature, but felt constricted by its tropes. The lone gunman, the glowing sunset, the town that must be saved. In Ruthie Fear, I set out to write a town that must be sacrificed, a toxic cloud of smoke, and a lone gun woman who pulls the trigger to destroy them all. Part of a cosmic regeneration, a rebirth that she has sensed from her first breath, which coincided with her father killing the last wolf in the Bitterroot Valley. And so again, a lot of my writing comes from this sort of dual reality of my childhood as a boy in Montana who loved to read and loved to be out in the woods, but never quite found anything in Western literature that mirrored that experience for me. And at the same time, growing up under a constant feeling of impending doom. When I was a kid, it was the hole in the ozone layer that kind of has transitioned into climate change, but there was always a sense that we were in some sense racing against the clock. And as a child, you process that very viscerally. So there was a lot of sort of confusion and fear. And I remember feeling so powerfully anytime I would learn that a new animal was on the endangered species list, or driving by a clear cut. Those things came through in this very unfiltered, emotional way. At the same time, I was in school with a lot of kids whose parents were loggers, or many of my friends and family hunted, and so it was sort of experiencing these two feelings often at the same time. And this book and all of my work is really sort of trying to reconcile those things, and then in a much broader sense, dealing with the fact that we are always living with the painful reality of change, and today those changes feel like they're happening so fast that it's very overwhelming for our nervous systems, it feels like. And so I wanted to write a book in which things changed slowly and then all at once, in the way that I feel that nature does, sort of like a natural disaster that builds before coming to sort of a cataclysmic head. I think that's all the sort of general background. I can get into every aspect of that in more detail if you have questions. But for now, I'd like to just read a brief section so you can sort of hear it the way that it appeared in my head. And we just had lunch together, a group of us, in the section in which Ruthie goes to Las Vegas came up. And so I'm going to read just the beginning of that because it was an important part for me. I really wrestled with the idea of having the entire book be sort of isolated and contained within the Bitterroot Valley versus having one section where she leaves. And in the end, I kept it because it felt sort of important for her to experience the outer world and be changed by it, and then go home with that change and that sort of distance from the natural world within herself. This is chapter 16. You're on gravel now, but if you get with God, it's blacktop all the way, the old woman said, handing Ruthie a bottle of water from a cardboard pallet on the hot bus to Las Vegas. Ruthie rubbed her eyes. She emerged from the blurred half-sleep that had carried her out of the Bitterroot Valley and down through Idaho. It was a trip she dreamt of her whole life, and then, in the exhaustion of packing and saying goodbye to her father, she slept through the whole thing. Her mouth was parched from the recycled air in the bus and the whiskey they'd drunk the night before. "Thank you," she said. The old woman smiled. Her dark brown cheeks shone with sweat. Her gold tooth flashed when the sun broke through the clouds. She spoke of the Mayan calendar and its misplaced portents. The world didn't end this time, she said, but it will soon. Happy birthday, Ruthie wanted to answer, drinking deeply of the cool water. My fellow lonesome rider, may you one day escape the darkness and experience the light. Lines she'd memorized from her favorite Wiley King song. She was 20 but felt much older. She'd stopped being young the moment the boy in the convenience store died in her arms. Ruthie raised her eyes to the window, thinking of her child self and expecting to see a winged skeleton flying low over the bus, its shadow stretched on either side. Or if not the skeleton, then the buckshot Rutherford had fired from his shotgun that day, bursting from the clouds to dent the roof after 15 years of flight. But she saw only the early summer sky of Utah, bleached to technicolor and as wide as a dream, the sky of Western movies with the Wasatch Mountains marching jaggedly south beneath it. They passed silent Mormon towns, and then they passed sprawling resort casinos, and Ruthie wondered if the devout and the debauched lived close together so they might see their opposite reflections in the mirror, each secretly pining for the other. Las Vegas appeared at dusk. Its red and gold lights called out from the desert in swirling, garish patterns, desires etched against the outer dark, a circus tent, a pyramid, a golden tower. On a billboard, a man fed a woman a cherry, dangling the fruit just above her parted lips. Airplanes glided silently to earth. A shaft of white light shot from the pyramid and pierced the sky. Ruthie rested her cheek on the plexiglass. She thought of the 1,000 paths she could walk, the shapes her life could take. She had $300 in her bag, the most money she'd ever had at one time, saved from a winter of shifts at the Montana Cafe. 5 cellophane-wrapped Bibles leaned against the waters beneath the old woman's seat. The old woman began to pray, her voice rising and falling, speaking for their entire fallen race. Ruthie didn't believe the world would end. Even if human beings were banished from it, its molten heart would continue to beat for 1 billion more years until it was re-enveloped by the sun. And even then, for a few moments more, as the dying goose's wing had continued to slap the ice. My fellow lonesome rider. Cars crowded in below the window. The bus slowed. Anxiety made Ruthie grip the arm of her seat. She'd never been on a road with more than 4 lanes before. She touched the stud in her lip with her tongue. She wanted to remain in the safety of the bus's artificial womb, breathing the circulating air and drinking water the old woman had given her. See the city through thick glass. They exited the highway onto a street so jammed with traffic the bus couldn't fully merge. The long cabin remained wedged halfway in the intersection amid a storm of honking. Drunken tourists streamed around both sides, carrying shopping bags, cameras, souvenir cups, and beer bottles held by the neck like small, glinting clubs. One man stopped and pounded the bus's luggage hold with his palm. He looked up at Ruthie, and his loose, Midwestern face was mottled with rage. He seemed ready to explode. With a wheeze, the bus pulled away, and the man stood in the road, gaping after it. "The dark one is in him," the old woman said, craning her head around. Ruthie wondered if Satan had an address in this very city, a bed they'd shared. She thought of Badger's angry, innocent face, the way violence had marked their time together. He'd gotten engaged soon after graduating to a cheerleader at Stevensville High, and Ruthie felt herself to be a star freed from the planets that had held it in place. The buildings were even bigger now that she was among them. They blocked out the sky. She had to tilt her head back to see the tops. Gamblers thronged casinos lit as if by daylight. They stared at the slot machines' flickering screens, yanked the levers down, watched the wheels spin, lost, 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 won. The old woman reached down and touched the Bibles beneath her seat to reassure herself. The 5 she'd brought hardly seemed enough to compete with the men on street corners snapping escort cards in their own cracking prayer. A thin, willowy branch held over the surging river of avarice. Grab on. Ruthie knew little of faith, but she expected madness, the crazed and ruthless wheel turns of fate. Lacy white scars covered her forearms from the glass on the gas station floor. Usually she hid them to avoid strangers' stares, but now she looked down at the landscape they formed, ran her fingers across the memory. The bus pulled to a stop at a wide intersection. 2 liquor stores on one side, the Statue of Liberty shrunken to a profane replica on the other. The roller coaster that twisted above its tarnished head was like the path of its own imagination, constrained in the gathering night, doomed to an endless shrieking loop. New York, New York. Ruthie was amazed by its cheapness and majesty. She felt naked under so many lights, amid so much movement. The old woman ceased her prayers and pulled herself up by the seat back in front of her. She turned to Ruthie. "You remember now," she said, "blacktop all the way." Ruthie nodded. The old woman smiled, humped her purse over her shoulder, and took up the waters and the Bibles. "If you see Satan," she said, "you spit in his eye." The smell of sweat, smoke, and a sad, touching hint of strawberry perfume wafted from her skin as she squeezed past. Her wide frame moved down the aisle to the front. Angel of the Greyhound, patron saint of dehydrated travelers. The doors hissed and clattered open as the old woman hobbled down the steps. Ruthie saw her again only briefly, stepping out from around the hood, then swallowed up in a mass of other bodies as the bus carried on. "Okay," Ruthie whispered to herself. "Here you are." Thank you. And for the rest of the time, I'll just open it up to any questions you all might have.
This is probably the elephant in the room, but what was with that ending? I mean, that, I think in the group we were in, there must have been about 15, and it took everybody by surprise, and it happened very quickly, and it just, once she shot that, it just.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. I mean, that was, you know, when I was first conceiving of this book, I knew I wanted to have an ending that would change everything that came before, and it was important to me because sort of what I was sensing from the world was that we were in this sort of slow period of change that was suddenly going to become very fast. And that was sort of how I had seen the natural world work. You know, you have long periods of of building, and then suddenly a storm comes and reshapes the landscape completely. And so I knew going into the book that I wanted to do that. I wanted to have this very slow, sort of realistic build in which the reader is sort of getting so lost in the world that they even kind of forget the creatures from the beginning and wonder if perhaps it was just Ruthie's imagination. And then, you know, the entire book really does hinge on that moment of when she decides whether to pull the trigger or not. And for me, the big sort of underpinning of the book and the underpinning of Ruthie's character and her namesake is that she's sort of torn in her life between being motivated by the fear and anger that is her father's sort of birthright to her, the sort of fear and anger he has at the world as a whole, and the position he occupies in the modern world, set against the innate connection she has to the natural world, and the sort of innate love and presence she feels with the animals she watches, with the trees, the landscape, the Bitterroot Valley, as a living being in itself. And so as soon as she pulls that trigger, I wanted everything to happen very fast, you know, because to me that's the point of no return, and also the point of you know, of rebirth for her. You know, it was important for me that the book doesn't end. You know, when I wrote the ending, I thought of it as a happy ending, because her story, she gets what she always wanted, which is to truly feel at one with the valley and truly be a part of it, and in the moment when she watches the wolf return. And so to me, the creature and the moment when she shoots the creature is the moment when she, in a sort of upside down way, you know, fulfills her dream and her destiny, and kind of, you know, reunites with this place of which she has always been a part, but which over the course of her aging she has felt increasingly disconnected. So yeah, it was, you know, there's a few books out there that I had really admired, and it was very important for me that the ending redefine everything that came before, and cause readers to sort of go back to the beginning to wonder if you know, how this had come to be. So yeah, the sort of rug pulling aspect of it was definitely important, and again, it felt important because it, for me at least, has sort of mirrored the experience of being alive, which is that there are often things happening within myself that I don't realize, and then something happens very quickly.
As a writer, you said you saw that an ending like that as you started writing, but did you, when you started writing, did you know that that's exactly what the ending would be, or does that come about as you're writing? Because it sounds like you had the idea.
A little of both. You know, this book in particular, I had a clearer idea of the ending than I usually do, and it was because I had envisioned, I had always wanted to write about the Bitterroot Valley, and I had always wanted to write about it in a sense that in the end, it's kind of an interesting story. I had my sister used to live in Red Lodge, and they bought a house. This was about 20 years ago, and the woman whose house it had been had died, and they found a box of her letters in the attic, and they were really amazing letters. And so my sister, knowing that I was a writer, gave me this box. And one of the letters that really fascinated me was about an earthquake that had happened in this region, I think in the early 80s. and she and her husband, their house had been destroyed. They'd lost everything. And she was writing to a friend about this experience. And there are a couple lines in it where she writes about how she can never look at the world the same way. And she said something like, "We've been standing on Jell-O the whole time." and I remember reading that and being like, yeah, that sort of is what it is to be human. You know, we think we're standing on terra firma, and we are, but at the same time, it can all change so quickly. And so that, you know, I knew that I wanted the book to end with some sort of a man-made natural disaster, some sort of a human instigated, because that was really important to some of the broader ideas of the book. So I knew I was writing toward a cataclysm, and I knew that I wanted her to somehow be at the center of it. I didn't know exactly what that would be until the creature aspect of the book started taking shape in my mind. So it was kind of both in that way.
I'd just like to say that Ruthie, for me, was a very convincing character.
Could you speak a little louder, please?
Yes. Ruthie, for me, was a very convincing character. And I was very engrossed in her life and her growth into a young woman. And I think you captured beautifully her. It certainly came through to me of her connection to the natural world. That was so strong all the time. And I also felt that Rutherford was an admirable character. He was wounded, but given that fact, he was very true and loving, of course, of his daughter. So I just wanted to thank you for Ruthie's characterization and for the opportunity to get to know her.
Yeah, that was. Thank you for saying that, and that was the joy of writing it for me. Was I got to know her too, you know, and the challenge, sort of the biggest challenge of a novel for me, and this was the first novel I finished, was a character that could sustain that many years-long relationship, you know, that would keep surprising me and stay in my mind and keep. And I, you know, countless times in writing this book, I was shocked by what Ruthie did, but at the same time feeling, yeah, really grateful because it was true. You know, it felt real in a way that you know, didn't feel like it was coming from my logical mind, but felt like it was coming from, you know, her spirit, whatever that may mean. And similarly, you know, Rutherford, he was, when I first conceived of the novel, I really had thought he was going to be the villain. You know, I thought I kind of had modeled him on a certain kind of man that I had grown up around and had a lot of anger toward. But over the course of writing the book, for me, he became the heart and soul of the book in a way that I totally did not expect. And by the end, the emotional, you know, crux of the book is the moment in the end when he says he's never known what to be proud of except her, you know, and that, like, totally, I had no idea that he was capable of that, you know, and it made me realize that a lot of these people that maybe I was angry with, you know, have that same capability, and so that's a big part of the joy of writing a book. Also, is the way that these people that maybe you think you know when you're coming up with them, they really surprise you and deepen and become something beyond what you had intended or imagined.
In the book, she had a really good friend, Pip, who was pregnant, and as all that carnage was happening, she wondered if had warned Pip about something was going to happen, but, and then she wondered if Pip made it out, but I don't think he ever said that in the book.
She made it out.
He did.
Yeah, yeah. In my mind, definitely. Yeah.
My husband and I would watch the show. I'd say, "Well, how do you think it's dead?" And he says, "Well, it ended."
Yeah.
So it's always in my mind. Well, it's over.
Yeah, in my mind, writing it, the intention was that she heeded the warning and took her child away, and it was sort of important because for me, Pip represented a character who sort of never doubted her connection to nature, or her. It really was a lot of the things that Ruthie struggled with were just sort of innate within her. And so she had kind of already learned the lesson that Ruthie learns through the course of this book. And so, yeah, in my mind, she made it out and sort of bore witness, to what had happened. And if there was going to be a season 2, she would be, her and her son would be, or her daughter, excuse me, would be sort of the focal point. Yeah.
I'm gonna tap that because to me that speaks to the issue of whether the carnage was just limited to Darby or not. Because I was certainly left with that question at the end of the book. Like, was this just a local disaster, or did it spread larger? But if Pip in fact got out, then that answers that question.
Yeah. I mean, I wanted to hint at it in the end when Ruthie is sort of in her spirit form and looking down, that in my mind, they had somehow created sort of a concrete wall around, through Lolo, and that this toxic cloud had dispersed enough by the time it left the valley. To limit the damage to this one place. Again, those things were, sort of nebulous in my mind, even as I was writing it. But it was important to me that the story, as much as being a story of Ruthie, is a story of the Bitterroot Valley as a character, and. So the things that are happening and the things that are changing are sort of exemplified in that microcosm, but I do think there are similar changes that are afoot all over the world.
Whatever happened to Ruthie's mother?
Ruthie's mother just couldn't handle being with Rutherford and living in that sort of state of constant anger and opposition that he, in my mind, especially when he's young, he's somebody who changes a lot over the course of the book, and in particular through his relationship with Ruthie. But when Ruthie is born and Ruthie's mother and Rutherford are both, quite young, still in high school, finishing high school themselves. And at that time, Rutherford is very angry and has very much sort of isolated himself, not only in the Bitterroot Valley, but in a very small part of the Bitterroot Valley. And so Ruthie's mother needs a bigger world, is how I thought. And so she leaves, and I, as the author, don't know much more than Ruthie. Ruthie, at a couple times in the book, imagines what might have happened to her mother, but sort of my knowledge of it doesn't go much farther than imagining it through Ruthie's eyes and what may have, what may have happened to her. But she left the Bitterroot Valley, and she never comes back.
Why did she leave Ruthie there?
In my mind, it's because she can't see herself making it in the wider world with a baby, and also perhaps as a gift for Rutherford, knowing that he would probably kill himself, through drink or, just if he doesn't have something to take care of, because she does, and there is also a sense that Ruthie, even as a very small baby, is incredibly connected to this place and to the natural world. She only falls asleep on the wolfskin rug, and I think her mother senses that and knows that this little girl is sort of meant to be here, and leaves her also for that reason.
When I was going to school in Missoula in the late 70s, I knew a lot of Rutherfords. It was the time of Round River and the forestry department, and they were always, oddly enough, not necessarily from Montana, but came to Montana, brooding, lonely, handsome, wildly attractive to all the female friends that I do. And none of their relationships seemed to last. I just totally knew who that guy was. And I'm just wondering, and it sort of reflects a little bit on your first book of short stories too, about the definition of being a man in the West and independent in a time where you don't get to be independent so much.
Yeah, and that's something I think about a lot, because I think that sort of fundamentally on a deep level, that's what needs to change. We have this entire mythology of self-sustenance that comes from literature, movies, the entire sort of mythos that was created over the West and the cowboy and all that. It was always this kind of radical self-reliance. And so I think from the beginning of my work, it has been to question whether that was ever true, whether there was ever, can you be self-reliant from nature? If you put yourself in opposition to nature, like to me, that's an impossible contradiction in terms. You are, no matter what you do, you are sort of a part of nature. And so the struggle of that kind of man, I think, is something. The ripples of that are something we're living amongst, no matter what, here in the West. And it definitely was a hugely defining aspect of my childhood, and it's fascinating to me to consider another way, to consider a kind of particularly masculinity, but also femininity that is autonomous, that is self-reliant, but that is also fully engaged with the fact that we are a part of the world. And to me, I come back over and over to this feeling of the freedom and surrender that comes from reacquainting ourselves with everything else alive. It's a wonderful feeling that I think everyone in the West has sometimes. It happens to me, if I'm hiking, deep in the Beartooth Mountains, sometimes I get this feeling of euphoria of where myself kind of evaporates, and I just feel very much a part of this landscape. And we all are, who live here, no matter what. Our feet we're connected to it in every moment. We're breathing it. And so, exploring these kinds of men that, were part of Missoula in the 70s and still Missoula in the 80s and 90s when I was a kid, and still Missoula now, is something I think I'm going to be working on and playing with for the rest of my career.
You read like a poet, and I wonder if you've ever had any idea about writing a book of poetry.
I've thought about it. Yeah, I think that I think I try in the moments of my fiction that I'm most proud of. I feel like I read a lot of poetry. You know, that's sort of what I go to, probably more even than fiction. And so that feeling of when writing, you know, purely transports you into a world kind of beyond logic. That is kind of the end goal of my fiction. You know, one day is to be able to sustain a whole book that you kind of leave the logical mind behind, and you're so in the flow of the language that you're kind of transported somewhere else. I have thought of writing poetry. Every time I sit down to write, even if it kind of starts as a poem, it seems to turn into a story. You know, it's definitely something I still think of and would love to do one day. But right now, there's something about the challenge of novels in particular, of creating a world and sustaining it over the course of a book that I'm really deeply engaged with. I think that, again, it feels very likely, because I used to feel that way about the short story, and then it turned into a novel, and so it feels very likely that poems could be next.
From a woman's, Ruthie's perspective?
Yes and no. I mean, I had a wonderful teacher who was who's like a fairly famous or prominent female author, and I was sort of wrestling with this when I was a student, and she told me a story that always stuck with me, and the story was, as a young woman, she had always only written from women's perspectives, and she'd felt very limited, like, oh, I only know how to write women, that's all I understand. And then once, as a thought experiment, she wrote a story from a woman's perspective, and then she just, on her computer, just Control F, searched and changed all the she's to he's. And when the story was published, there was just this outpouring of acclaim, like, how do you understand men so well? How did you get so deep into a man's head? Like, how were you able to do this? And the way she explained it to me was that the trouble we get into often is that we romanticize the opposite sex a little bit. Like, if you're a man, you kind of assume men are worse, and if you're a woman, so that was sort of what she had broken through in that moment, was she's just like, I'm going to write this guy just as, you know, crazy and mixed up and neurotic and confused and angry, and as I write my women, and everybody just was so enamored with it. And so that story was very liberating for me, because I realized, okay, if I'm gonna write from a woman's perspective, I just need to remain fully aware and engaged that the range of emotion and experience is just the same. It's just as wide, it's very human. And when I started thinking about it that way, it became easier in some way, because it was a way that I always stayed awake. You know, when I'm writing from a man's perspective, it's a little easier to slip into kind of a default, like, oh, I'm a man, I know what he would think in this moment. But it's always important, the character isn't me, you know? And so having her be a woman was a way that in every moment I didn't slip into, I was like, what is Ruthie thinking in this moment? Not what am I thinking? And so in that sense, there were ways I think it actually made it easier. There were definitely some challenging moments where I, needed to get feedback from women to make sure that I hadn't veered into my own, hadn't lost the track. But in those ways, it was actually almost easier.
One of the most moving parts of the book to me, there were many moving parts, but was the mother who lost the boy.
Mm-hmm.
That moment just brought me to tears. Mm-hmm. And the way you wrote what the mother said, mm-hmm. was that, something that you learned from Native Americans, or she's Native American, correct?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I just, because Ruthie was so nervous,
Mm-hmm.
and, you know, didn't really know what to do. And you got that emotional movement just spot on. I just wanted to thank you for that. Just, how did you know that? Did you just think of that?
I really appreciate you saying that, because that, you know, that was one of the 2 or 3 chapters in the book that was the hardest for me to write, you know, and that I kind of put off the longest, because I knew, you know, different culture and also experiencing a loss that I've never, you know, the loss of a child. And so it was a chapter that I thought about a lot, and trying to really deeply embody and live both, yeah, Ruthie's nervousness, but also the feeling of obligation that brings her there, and the mother. And you know, it was similar to the, you know, there's so often when I worry that I'm getting in over my head, I so often return to sort of the, you know, there are certain really universal truths of being a human that don't matter anything about your circumstances, and the relationship with a child and is absolutely one of those. And at the same time, it was really important for me for this book to have Ruthie reckoning with the sort of deeper history of the valley, and the cultures that had lived there for so long. And that I think is a, you know, that's something that we're all embodying, because we are, you know, we are of this place now, you know, in the same way. It's a very complicated thing that I think about. You know, my family is Russian. I have a Russian name. I've never been to Russia. I don't speak Russian. You know, I have no connection other than my name and some recipes and, you know, some stories that, you know, this is who I am. But at the same time, there is this reality that who I am was sort of violently paved over what was here before. And so in that chapter, it's all of those things. It's this, you know, the boy who died was, you know, he was lost in the middle between this world and his own, and an older one, and you know, he was a victim of that. And so in that chapter, I wanted that to be felt as well. So it was, yeah, I really appreciate you saying that, because it was a very delicate and challenging one to write.
I felt there was another layer there too, though, like with Ruthie's mom and her sense of loss and grief, even though Ruthie didn't die, there was that loss of her child in a sense too.
Absolutely.
So I saw another parallel there.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it was important for me, you know, every character in the book is sort of an orphan in some sense, and in my mind, everybody was missing the big, you know, capital P parent of Mother Nature. You know, everybody was struggling to sort of find, and so I wanted each character to be missing a literal parent to sort of bring that conflict more into clarity, you know, so they would sort of be constantly faced with that loss and looking at the natural world for a solution. So yeah, that was definitely at play there as well.
Are the creatures a product of a lab experiment gone wrong?
Yeah, you know, I really wanted to not. I didn't really want the creatures to be any one thing, you know. When I was thinking about this, it came up in our conversation at lunch. One of the literal things that the creatures came from was, I was thinking a lot about trophy hunting, and Rutherford, his profession is taxidermying and cleaning skulls, and that, you know, one of my defining memories of the Bitterroot Valley is going into the steakhouse in Lolo for the first time, and it's this gallery of animal heads of every different kind. And when I was a little kid, it was this mixture of like awe and revulsion. I was like, oh my God, it's so cool. That's a mountain lion, and oh my God, there's a mountain goat, and and then it's also like, why are they on the wall? And so there was a part of the creature that came from wanting to create something that no trophy could be taken from. So a headless being. It was definitely important to me that I suppose in my mind, yes, there's definitely a connection between the lab and the creatures. I was thinking that whenever I wrote them, that, part of the, I didn't want the book to just be sort of condemning or dissecting the, Montana archetype of the poor redneck hunter who's out there hunting animals indiscriminately. I think that there is a thoughtlessness just as vast and dangerous among the ultra-educated scientist community represented by the lab as well, in terms of, and in both senses, I think it comes from a similar impetus of this idea that we can control nature rather than living with it. And so on one side, you're controlling nature by killing animals and cutting down the trees, and on the other, you're controlling nature by playing around with diseases and chemical weapons in a lab and experimenting on animals and a lot of things that I find equally sort of horrifying. And so, yeah, in my mind, the creatures did. There's no accident that the creatures were in the Bitterroot Valley right around that lab.
Are you writing another book right now?
I am, yeah. I actually, I finished another book. I'm waiting for edits from my editor. And so deep in the later stages of, we're hoping it'll come out in 2024. And it's very much sort of a piece with this. I've always sort of thought of the collection, this, and the book that I'm finishing now as sort of a trilogy of my experience of the contemporary West. But this book actually is set in the 70s, kind of at the birth of the environmental movement and the separatist movement, and a lot of the issues in Montana that I think we're feeling in contemporary times sort of started then. And so it's set in central Montana, mostly in the 70s.
Anybody else? Well, thanks so much, Matt.
Thank you all.